Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chelsea from ICEAA, welcoming you to another of ICEAA's Technology Showcase webinars, where the providers of the tools that make your jobs easier get to show off the latest and greatest with their products. Today's webinar is sponsored by Palisade, and we'll be learning more about using their at-risk software. I'd like to welcome Dr. Steve Van Drew, who is giving his 5th Tech Showcase webinar presentation, Modeling Unit Learning Curves from Lot Data. Steve?
Yes. Thank you very much, Chelsea. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am on today representing Palisade, the makers of At-Risk, but I promise not to spend a whole lot of time pitching their product. In fact, it's a very minor part of what I'm going to show you. Most of what we'll be doing today focuses more on the kind of the algebraic approach to this. It's only at the very end where I introduce anything that At-Risk is doing. I also need to emphasize that I'm doing it in Excel. I'm not using ACED or any of the other tools that you may have access to. So this is an Excel, primarily Excel application with at the very end just a small bit of what At-Risk can do to handle specifically the error term associated with this, this model we're going to be building together. And come on, slides advance. There we go. So the title of the presentation, as Chelsea said, Modeling Unit Learning Curves from Lot Data. And I know that's a very specific title. This is a very specific topic that I'll be covering. Just to be sure that you're picking up on the maybe not so subtle hints in the title. I am talking about unit learning curves as opposed to cum average. And I'm talking about specifically how to model the situation, the phenomenon of learning or improvement or experience that you hopefully already are somewhat aware of, but not doing it from data that's spelled out unit by unit, but instead is presented as lot data. And the reason I'm taking this approach is that it actually adds a complication to things that if you've never heard of before, it's going to kind of be a little bizarre and almost a circular reference sort of thing. But that specifically is what we'll be doing, unit learning curves, not cum average. And I won't even be talking about the rate side of unit learning, just specifically unit learning curves, but presented from a how do you handle and treat lot data to come up with the learning curve itself. So with that in mind, here are the specific topics I'm going to be covering. Start with some of the fundamentals of learning or experience or improvement curves, whatever you prefer to call them. And it is an older concept, and goes back to the early 1900s, if you will, and you can kind of see that in the two graphics, the images that I have presented along the side of this slide. In fact, you may wonder why we're still talking about it if it really looks like it goes back to all the Model T days and the Ford assembly lines and things. But we'll talk about the fundamentals themselves of learning curves. And then I want to address one specific regression technique that focuses on the power model, because the power model is the form of regression equation that is used to model unit learning curves. So we're gonna have to talk about the power model itself and how to perform regression with that. Then I need to spend some time talking about how to work with lot data. Is specifically something referred to as calculating the algebraic lot midpoint, the lot midpoint, how to approximate that. And that's what gives us the little added difficulty of working with lot data, is how to handle that data and come up with this midpoint approximation. And once those concepts have been covered, I'll jump into Excel and demonstrate how to do the data transformation that's necessary, how to use one specific function in Excel called line st, as well as goal seek, which a number of you may not have ever used. And then finally, I'm going to introduce the at-risk implementation, and that I owe that to Palisade, since they're the ones that have paid your association for the time that we're spending together today. So that last little bit is where at-risk will get introduced. In case you were thinking, why are we studying this if it's only applied to old assembly line ideas, I've got two more graphics that I wanted you to see. Got a little bit of latency with my slide presentation. There we go. On the left in this newest graphic, you're looking at a Boeing 787 Dreamliner assembly area. which is certainly a lot more current than the Model T. And you're also there in that lower middle graphic looking at iPhone, and I believe this is from China, but it's iPhone assembly line, so to speak. Maybe not quite the same Henry Ford approach to assembly, but certainly something that could be modeled with the learning curve phenomenon. So please don't think just because I started with black and white graphics that it's not applicable today. It absolutely is. So here's the basic, what I've referred to as unit learning curve theory laid out in all its glory. It is also, you may also have heard it referred to as Crawford or as Boeing learning curve theory. And I've also mentioned, and I will again, that some people talk about experience curves instead of learning curves. Some people refer to them as improvement curves. You'll hear it expressed all kinds of ways depending on the industry, the background of the individual doing. So all of those are really talking to the same thing: unit, Crawford, Boeing, learning experience or improvement curves. This specific form says, and I'll read it to you because it has a few things that need to be highlighted here. As the number of units produced doubles, the unit, and that's in bold on purpose, the unit cost or time to produce the doubled unit decreases by a constant percentage. So in the block, the way the data is presented here, if, for example, you knew that either the cost or the time, it doesn't have to be just cost, could be time as well, like man hours. If either the cost or time to produce the first one takes $100, 100 hours, whichever you're modeling, then the theory says that when we double from 1 to 2, that's a doubling, if you experience some decrease in the time or cost to produce the second one, then you're starting to demonstrate some kind of learning experience improvement. If when you double from 2 to 4, what you receive in return is another decrease by a constant percentage, now you're starting to see this absolute decrease that models the unit learning curve idea. And the reason the focus is on unit here is because we're looking at the first, the second, the fourth. These are the doubled unit numbers. 100 to 90 is a decrease of 0.9, 90 to 81, a decrease of 0.9, 81 to 72.9, another decrease of 0.9. So this would be a perfect fit, to tell you the truth, and you're not going to see anything quite that perfect. But if you are approximately experiencing something like this, then maybe you've got a situation that could be modeled with this unit learning curve. A graphic of this where the y axis is the time or the cost, the x-axis is the unit number being produced. What you would see with this phenomenon is the curve that's demonstrated here. It is in fact a power curve. It could be written a times x raised to the b, where, as you see spelled out, y is the cost or the time of that specific x unit. So whatever x you're modeling in the equation is the cost or time you are talking about for that unit. A has a special significance. It's the cost or the time of the first unit. In fact, in many places it's referred to as T1, the theoretical cost for time of that first unit. So the constant A in this equation has a very specific meaning. In fact, if we looked over here, we're starting in this example with 100 as the cost or time for that first unit. So I know already that A in this equation, if I go to model it, should be 100. Go down the line, you see what X is. B, I'm gonna have to explain a little bit. It is an exponent in this power model. To get to the exponent, you would calculate the natural log of the slope of that model, and it's expressed in decimal form. So in the example I'm showing here, 100 to 90, 90 to 81, 81 to 72.9, that slope, so to speak, is a 0.9, a 90% constant decrease as you're going from doubling units through there. The natural log of that divided by the natural log of 2 gives you the value for B, that exponent. And so in our particular case, these four values that we're seeing here, the A is a T1, the cost or time of that first unit. There's the first unit, its cost or time was 100, so A becomes 100 in this case. And as you've seen, you working with that 0.9 as the slope, we come up with a B of negative 0.1520. There is the equation for the power model right there. And this could be done with regression if we had unit costs or time for the first, the second, the fourth, and they don't have to be the doubled. You could still fit a regression equation through this with the third and the seventh and the, the non-doubled units. It's just that constant percentage decrease is being experienced as the units are doubling. There should still be, if you're collecting it this way, some cost or time for the third unit, for the fifth, sixth, seventh. It's just the reason these are shown like this in the table is that's when the doubling is occurring. So that's when you would be expecting that constant decrease. And hopefully I made that clear. Now, I need to show this because for most people, if this is the first time you've seen it, and for a cost estimating society, I doubt it is, but if it is, think to begin with of a linear regression equation, ordinary least squares, y versus x, and in this particular case, it's an upward sloping line. You'd have the equation for a line, y-intercept plus the slope times the value of x. That's the equation for a line. You look over to this middle section, this is where the power model is, and up in the top graphic, that's exactly the one I had from the slide before. It is the learning curve equation. It's the power model. What we've been taught to do and what I'm going to demonstrate for you today is a very fortunate aspect of working with the power model, and that's that algebraically, if you transform the y's and the x's, take the natural log of y, natural log of x, what starts out as a power function up here, a curve, becomes a linear equation in the lower section. So in the transform space, what many people refer to as fit space, you end up algebraically with this equation, which if you look closely is exactly an equation for a line. Just like this had an intercept and a slope, slope times x plus the intercept gives you y. Here we have the natural log of x times a slope plus the natural log of a, which will be an intercept, giving us the natural log of y. So by transforming from the raw, the unit data, by transforming the y values, which are going to be cost or time, and the x values, which will be unit numbers, by transforming that through natural logs, we end up with what's known as an intrinsically linear transformation. And this is the section that we're concentrating on for the rest of this presentation. I do owe it to you, for those of you that have worked with these, to say that by doing a transformation of similar data where you only transform the y but leave the x alone, you're in fact working with another one of the intrinsically linear formulas, and it started from an exponential form of an equation. So you could go through the algebra here, see that this is your unit space, this is the fit space, and sure enough, it's just another equation. But for our purposes, it's this middle one that we're working with. Right? With that in mind, there is one other thing that I need to make clear to you, and that's that since we're talking about performing regression on the data, whether it was unit or, as we'll see, lot data, if you start with the power model and have this curve y of x, and there's a formula for it, do your transformation, natural log y, natural log of x, where it is the equation for a line. You may not remember this, but when you first studied linear regression, in particular, specifically, the ordinary least squares form of linear regression, you were taught that there's also an error term that comes along with this statistical procedure called regression. And that error term in ordinary least squares has some assumptions behind it. The assumptions say that it will be normally distributed about the equation for a line. The errors will be additive in nature. They'll have a mean of 0 and a constant variance and be independent of each other. So that's a mouthful. That's a lot of assumptions about this one error term. But for our purposes, please hold on to the idea that it is additive in nature and it's normal with a mean of 0. So what that does is give you unbiased predictions, if you will, off of that equation. 50% of the time you're above, 50% of the time you would be below, is what that normal with the mean of 0 says. The catch here is that when you go back and talk in terms of the power model now, which is where you need to be because those are the hours or the dollars that you really want to work with. When you work with the power model, it's not an additive error term anymore. It's a multiplicative log normal error term. And to further confuse you, what was a mean over here of 0 in the log normal is a median of 1. Its mean will be something greater than 1, depending on the error associated with the regression fit. And this is a really key concept, and I will be demonstrating this in my quick little at-risk piece of this. This is where at-risk, the simulation aspect, if you will, can come into play, is how do you handle the error term associated with your regression? Well, in transform space, it's additive normal. Back in the unit space, where you're talking hours and dollars or hours or dollars and specific units, it is a multiplicative log normal error term. And so that you know how to do this, if you're going to do it yourself, we have normal with a mean and a standard deviation. If that's the random variable involved, then raising e to that power actually gives you a log normal distribution with a mean and standard deviation. We call that random variable x. The mean of the random variable x you would find using this formula. The variance for that random variable x uses this formula. Now, why is that important to you? If you're not an at-risk user, let's say you're using Crystal Ball or you're using ACEAA, you would have to model the error term in unit space with the log normal distribution, and the parameters for that distribution would be the calculated mean and the calculated square root of its variance to give you the standard deviation. So knowing how to make these calculations, if you're kind of brute forcing this model yourself in one of the other packages, you'd have to make that calculation. It's one of the advantages of at-risk, though. At-risk has a second form of the log normal distribution called the log norm 2. And it remains with the parameters from the normal distribution in fit space. In other words, I'm still going to give it a 0 here, and I'm still going to, as you'll see when I demonstrate this, give it the standard error from the regression fit. And at risk, by using this risk log norm 2, this function will do those calculations for me and provide me with the unit space log normal. I know that's a mouthful. Hopefully my demonstration will clear that up, but this could become an important slide to you if you happen to need to make those calculations yourself. With at risk, you can avoid it by using this special formulation of the distribution. There's a website listed here. And you may be interested. If what I've just talked you through is like totally foreign to you, I'm giving you a link to a free Palisade webinar, about an hour-long webinar that I gave a few months back for Palisade on modeling regression errors with at-risk. This is the URL for it. It'll take you to a free hour-long video of how to handle, and some of the slides are the same, to quite frankly. This one right here is talked through extensively, as well as the idea of additive normal versus multiplicative log normal. So if I went a little too quick for you there, I would suggest please going to this webinar video and watching that. I'm going to open up. I have my control panel closed, so I'm not seeing any chat session stuff. I just opened it. I still don't see anything. Megan, is there anything I ought to stop and answer right now? Or Chelsea?
No questions so far.
Okay. Well, good. So with that bit of fundamental background, let's move on to, if it will, there we go. Let's move on to a specific problem. And I imagine, given the audience that I'm talking to, that you're all familiar with what a lot is. When I presented this to a little wider audience, that didn't even dawn on me to explain what a lot is. And I had a number of questions early on. What do you mean by a lot? So I know it goes without saying, but here it is anyway. We're talking about a lot that maybe it's an annual run, maybe it's a fixed setup for a production run. You run it and then you're done with it. So maybe it's a contractual kind of sizing that's been done. But in this particular problem, we're being given information on 5 lots, lot 1 through 5. The size of each of those lots are, as you can see in the second column. It's going to be important for the calculations we're going to make to think about lot 1, starting at unit 1, going through unit 15. Lot 2 picks up where that left off, so the next 10 will be 16 through 25, etc. So if you add all of these up, we're up to 165 units. Then for the lot, not a specific unit within the lot, but for that first lot of 15, we're being told it took 35,000, let's call them man hours. The second lot, which was only 10 units, took 20,500 on down the line. Here's the catch. What this does for us is presents us with a new problem. If this had been presented to me as data for individual units within the lot, and I have the cost or the man hours associated with each individual unit, then I could just do the transformation I mentioned a moment ago and fit a regression line through that data. I don't have it that way. I've got a lot of 15 units, and that entire lot, I've got the man hours associated with it. It's not that uncommon to collect data this way. You know, in fact, it's probably, especially for massive quantities of things, it would be more unusual to see single unit call outs of the number of man hours taken to produce that. So this is not that unusual. It presents us with a different algebraic issue though, and that's that I know that represents 15 units being produced, but if I divide that by 15, all that gives me is the average cost of those 15. It doesn't give me the specific cost or man hours of any one of them. And they are not the same because we're claiming that there is some learning experience improvement taking place here. So if it's taking place, then how much of this total goes to unit 1 is more than unit 2, 3, 4 on down to 15. All I know by dividing 35,000 by the 15 units in that lot is what on average that the 15 units are going to cost or take to produce. So the question becomes, what unit number has an average associated with what the 35,000 divided by 15 gives? And it's not necessarily going to be a whole number of unit. It might be the 7.6134 unit. Algebraically is where that curve would have to go through at a specific slope for learning to give us the same average that would work out to be. And I know that may be a little confusing for you, but that's the basic problem. We're being given a total in man hours in this case for the first lot of 15 units. Sure, I can divide 35,000 by 15 and it'll give me a number, but that number is just an average of each of these individual ones. What X do I associated that one Y with? And then the next Y, which X is it associated with? Somewhere in that range. That concept is referred to as a lot midpoint. Where within this lot is the midpoint that if we produced it would have the cost associated that is calculated to be the average of the lot. That's the idea here. Okay. So in words, and I've got this goofy professor off on the side going, say what? The lot midpoint, also called the algebraic lot midpoint or lot plot point, is defined as the theoretical unit whose cost or time is equal to the average unit cost or lot average cost for that lot on the learning curve. That LMP, the lot midpoint value, represents the X value, and the average unit cost represents the Y value when working with lot data. So what that's telling us is, yes, you can calculate 35,000 divided by 15. That gives you a Y, but what's the X that goes with that Y? Because without the paired X, you can't perform regression on this. That X is referred to as the lot midpoint. So we need to be able to calculate that. And here's the rub. The difficulty in finding the lot midpoint is that you must know the slope of the learning curve in order to determine the lot midpoint. But you need all the lot midpoints to find the slope of the learning curve. There's the circular logic. If you read that through again and again and again, your head's going to start spinning because you go, all right, I need to find the lot midpoint. How do I find a lot midpoint? You need the slope. Okay, what's the slope? I can't tell you unless you tell me what the lot midpoints are. And that's basically what that bumper sticker is saying. So you make an assumption. You check to see how good the assumption is. You adjust it. You do the work again and again and again. And that's where GoalSeek can help us, the Excel's feature called GoalSeek. So what we need to do here, and this will kind of operationalize the calculations we have to do, for every one of the lots, I need to make an assumption about what the learning curve is. So I would expect if I'm experienced learning curve, it's going to be somewhere between a 0 and a 1.0, maybe a 90%, like we saw in the table of data I presented several slides ago. Well, that would get you to a calculated value for the slope coefficient. Natural log of 0.9 divided by natural log of 2. That becomes the part of the exponent here. It also becomes part of the exponent here and here, part of this calculation. So that B shows up in multiple places in the equation to solve for a lot midpoint. In other words, to find the lot midpoint, you have to assume a slope. Calculate its B, find that lot midpoint. For that same slope, do the same thing for each lot. So in our example, we have 5 lots that I would have to make first an assumption about the slope, go through first unit in the lot, last unit in the lot, make the substitution, solve for lot midpoint. Then I need to run a regression through those. And if the regression comes back and says, the slope that you guessed is spot on, you're done. But it won't be. I mean, you just be absolute coincidence if what you guessed to begin with ends up where it is. So it becomes an iterative process. I've got a bumper sticker here telling you that CoStat, ACID's stats module, uses a 6-term alternate lot midpoint approximation formula. So they've got one that's a little more complicated than this, fundamentally does the same thing, ultimately gets you to within the tolerance that you've got GoalSeek at, gets you to the same result. But if you're curious, if you're an ACID user and are using CoStat to do this kind of thing, and we're curious about what it does, I've got a backup slide that has that formula. So if everybody's with me, this is a static shot of what I'm going to be demonstrating live so that I can talk you through it real quick though. And for those of you that maybe for wherever you are, maybe you can't get to Excel right now and open up the file that was provided. In case you didn't see it, in the control panel, there's a section called handouts. My PowerPoint as well as the Excel file that I'll be demonstrating from in a moment are both available to you on the GoToWebinar control panel. But here's a static shot of it so you can kind of help navigate your way around. I've got a set of general steps 1 through 5 here that are not showing in this screenshot of the spreadsheet, but they're in the lower left area, kind of in the column BCD, below row 25, 26, down in that section next to my Palisade logo. In the actual spreadsheet are these same 5 steps, but here's what I'm going to be walking you through just to help you navigate. First thing is in B4 through F8, the yellow section here, I've got the first lot, 5 lots, the data that was presented in that problem statement a moment ago. Then I've got in cell C13, in this particular layout, I'm given a slope, and right now I've got it locked in at 85.3%. And you'll see that's where we're going to end up in a moment. But I'm going to start with something other than that so that you're not looking at the final answer later. But this is where we're going to end up landing on. So I may start with something like a 90% and see how close that gets us. But you put it, and it's an assumption, you put a starting slope in cell C13. Then you run GoalSeek, and in this graphic image, the screenshot I took, you see a an image of what the dialog box from GoalSeek is going to look like. And if you've never used it before in Excel, go to the data ribbon. Under what if analysis, you'll see a choice for GoalSeek. Very simple little dialog box to fill out. It says what set cell do you want to use? And for this particular layout, it's E14, which is right here, shows up right now as a negative 0.001. I want the GoalSeek to get that set value to a 0. And there's a tolerance in the background I could change by going in and messing with the global settings. But basically it's saying, hey, get as close to 0 as you can within the tolerance for this procedure that I've got a setting for. And then it says, okay, what do you want me to do to get to that 0 in cell E14? What cell do I change to do that? And for me, that's where that assumed slope is, that 85.3%. So what you can imagine is taking place here. I've got an assumed value of 85.3% for the slope. The calculated B is there. It will, and I'll show you how this happens when we're live, but it comes back and says, I fit a regression equation through there. It's got that same slope. It's got a within one, what is that, 10,000th. I've got the same value for B. That's close enough. That's within tolerance. The GoalSeek would come back and say, I'm there. If you're okay with the answer, say yes and save the results. So all of that's happening through GoalSeek. It is, you give it an assumed slope, it does the regression, solves for what the slope would be with those lot midpoints based on the assumed slope, and it compares the calculated B from that assumption and the regressed B from that solved slope. And when that is within the tolerance of being at 0, it says, okay, we're there. So the next thing that I would do, and I didn't say this in the lot data in the description of the problem, but I'm doing this because I want to come up with a cost or man hours for the next lot. So the next lot to us is referred to as lot 6. It starts at, it's going to be 45 units, starting at unit 166 and going up to 210. So I've got a couple of calculations over in here we'll have to talk about, but I ultimately am saying, all right, once you've arrived at the solution for the slope and are happy with it, it's within the tolerance of the GoalSeek. Now tell me what the predicted cost or man hours is going to be. And then this cell F10 is where my at-risk is going to come into play. So I'm not just taking a predicted value, I am going to operationalize that concept of a multiplicative log normal error term. And all that's going to happen in cell F10 to give us a combined total of F11. So I'm going to run the risk simulation. I only have one input, just that log normal error term. And when I run the simulation, I'm going to ask it to pay attention to what happens in cell 11, F11. So those are the general steps I'm going to follow. This is kind of the layout, not a real big or fancy complex model, but it operationalizes all those things I talked about, calculating the lot midpoint from an assumed slope, going through and bouncing back and forth between the fit space and back to the unit space, and then introducing this simulated error term. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to jump out of my PowerPoint slide. Boy, this is going slow today.
Hey, Steve, we have a question.
Okay.
It's from, if they're asking if GoalSeek is not available, can Solver substitute?
Solver is an optimization routine. GoalSeek is a kind of a single, change one thing in order to accomplish something else. So Solver it requires much more information than what GoalSeek does. Solver, I'd have to say whether I want to min or max a certain cell. I'd have to give it constraints. And I'm sure with a little thought, you can kind of dumb it down to do what GoalSeek does. So I'm going to say, I would never do it that way because I've got access to GoalSeek, but I'm pretty certain it could still be done. You just would have to tweak what the constraints are, what the decision variables are, what the objective is. GoalSeek is much more straightforward. Hey, make this cell this value by changing this. Bang, done. No constraints, nothing. No min, max constraints. Hopefully that answered the question. Okay, I'm going to assume it did. So here's my spreadsheet, and I'll blow it up where you can see it. I've also included some graphs off to the side, and what I was telling you about the general steps is they're here within the spreadsheet as well. So the same steps I talked you through a moment ago with that screenshot of the spreadsheet are listed here in this section. I'm going to scroll down a little bit so you can see most of the work. I want to make sure you recognize this as Excel, and there's the home ribbon right there, but I also have at risk added in. And because of that, there's a couple of cells in here that when you open it, you're probably seeing a pound name or a pound value, unless you're an at-risk user. So I have at risk added in, and so this cell in particular, as well as this one, that's probably the only two that are impacted. But cell F10 and F11, if you don't have at risk, you're only going to be able to click in them and see what function is being used. It won't actually, and you'll be able to see my output as well, but you won't really be able to run all of what I've done. Okay, so if you're wondering why you might have opened the one I sent and opened it and you're seeing a pound name or a pound value, that's what's going on in F10 and F11. It takes at risk to get those functions implemented because they're both risk functions. So let's talk through it fairly quickly, if you will, please. I've got, like I said, a layout of the raw data. I'm using that fancy formula to come up with the lot midpoint approximation, and I'll double click there so you can see what's going on. I know I'm between unit 1 and 15. I know that the average is 3,500. The average for that lot is 35,000 divided by 15. What I'm trying to figure out is what unit has that cost that is the average unit cost. So it's coming down here and it's grabbing whatever my assumed slopes B was, and it's using that multiple times throughout this calculation. So all this is an implementation of the slide I showed you with that lot midpoint approximation. And if you look at it, it's telling us that unit number, if there was such a thing, unit number 6.0993, if we could produce that specific unit, its cost is 35,000 divided by 15. Its unit, the average unit cost for that lot is what the 6.0993 specific one would be. So why is that important? Because without that information, I can't plot my power, and ultimately then, this is unit space up above, and then I can't work with the transformed costs down here. I need X and Y pairs in order to either work with the power model or the intrinsically linear model. That's why I need the lot midpoint. But the formula for lot midpoint needs the slope because it needs the B that's calculated from that slope. And so the key is right down there in C14. So right now, and you can watch what happens in here, all these values are going to change as well as the plots will change. If I came in here and made this a 60, for example, for 60%, you see that all the lot midpoints changed. All of the transform values for the lot midpoints changed. You're getting different equations involved in here, different plots of both the power as well as the line. And all of the statistical callouts in this section have changed. So it all really drives from what you're assuming for a slope. I'm going to go back to 90 here. You saw all of that change again, hopefully. But once I know this would be pure coincidence if what I'm assuming is where I end up getting to when it's all done. In fact, you can see right now, when I assume a slope of 90, the regression through these values, their transform values, is giving me a slope of 85.2%. So there's a breakdown there. There's a disconnect, if you will. I assumed 90 so that I could get the lot midpoints. With those lot midpoints, it's telling me the best fit would give a slope back of 85.2%. I don't have the right assumed slope until these two match up. Those two match up, and I could have put my 0 back here, but this is a little more fidelity. So I work with the B's, the natural log transform of it to get down there. When that's a 0, I will be comfortable that my assumed slope and my regressed fit slope are the same. All right, so I hope there's one other thing in here that you may not be familiar with unless you use Excel a lot. There's a function, and it's what's called an array function. You know that, well, it's an array function. called line ST. And what it needs is, you see when I double click on this, it highlights the XY pairs from up above. And then it gives, as an array, it gives this block of data without any labeling. So this is me going back for your benefit and labeling off to the left and then off to the right what these 10 different values are. So it's a table of a statistical summary of this line fit over here, which is the fit space, intrinsically linear fit from that transformed XY values. And I can see it because it's possible to do it in charting in Excel, to go in and just ask for that equation for a line. And sure enough, you see that the intercept is 8.2195. There's the intercept, 8.2195. You can see here that the slope is going to be a 0.2305, and it is a negative. And sure enough, over here, there's the slope. So it's intercept plus a negative slope times x. So we have a downward sloping line, which translates to this power curve that's dropping off the way it does. So in the upper section, you're looking at the power curve. That's the equation for the power curve. And Excel will even tell you that that's the equation. But for reasons that'll make a little more sense in a moment, I need to work with it as a line, because that's where I get the information about the quality of the fit in fit space. And that's what all of these statistical values are that came out of line ST, because I used the transform data. It is a fit space transformed statistical summary, if you will. And that's why I've got the caution down here in yellow, is be careful with these numbers. They're really all talking to where it's aligned, which is fit space. If I wanted to, I'll just leave it at that for now. So a number that's going to become important to me as I introduce the simulation is that standard error right there. The standard error of Y is a 0.0734. And that's in this fit space. It sounds pretty small, and it is, because it's in this natural log, the log space, if you will. What it is back up here is a whole different matter. And that's where the transformation would have to take place if you want to go back and work in unit space. So and here's how it works. I'm going to go in and do this live for you. If you've never used GoalSeek before, I'm going to go to the data ribbon. On the data ribbon under what if analysis, it's GoalSeek. We go to the GoalSeek, and because I was already in, no, I wasn't there yet. So it's allowing me to tell it what cell to set, and I'm going to pick that one. It's telling me, it's asking me what do you want that to be. I want it to be a 0, and I'm going to change that. I'm going to change the assumed cell right there to get to that point. So it should say E14, 0, C13, and it's exactly what my image is here. So notice right now, you're looking at 90% as the assumed. The regression was done automatically because I have the statistics in there that do that for us. When I say okay, just see how a couple of times you saw it rifle through there. It took about 3 or 4 iterations, and it's telling me it found the 4 decimal places it got to its current value of 0 for my target. And if that's what I wanted it to do, say okay. And if you look in the formula bar, I've got it rounded here to 1 decimal, but you can see that it's telling me the slope you want to work with is 85.343129, ... So it's telling me, if I had jumped in to start with and said, assume the slope's 85.3, all these lot midpoints would use that to calculate them. And when I fit the equation to it, it would say, yep, 85.3 is the right slope to work with. So what do we do with that information? I pull from out of this section what I need to model it as either the line over here or to model it as the power curve up here, depending on whether I want to work with an additive normal error or a multiplicative log normal. I would either work with the power curve formulation or the linear equation down here. But if I do my work with the fit space line, I have to remember as the last step to raise E to that power to get it back into dollars. What I've chosen to do is to go in and say, first of all, since we now know what the best fitting slope is, let's use the equation that we've found and solve for what the lot midpoint would be between the 166th and the 210th unit. In other words, that new lot what that lot midpoint of 187.4 is where the average cost is going to apply. So I've got the X, now I need to solve for the Y from that lot. That, and you can see what I've pulled in. I pulled in the intercept, I pulled in the T1 value, which is our A, and I've pulled in the B, the exponent. I've multiplied it by that lot midpoint, and then finally I've multiplied it by the lot size, because the first, without that C9, you're only finding out what the average cost of the lot is. Well, I'm buying 45 units with that average cost, so that's the last piece of the calculation. When you're done, you find out a little over 50,000 man hours to produce that sixth lot is what's going to be involved. So that is where many of you would stop. And that's a predicted man cost or time for that sixth lot. And if I stop there, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it's a point estimate in essence. If you have the capability, the next step is to say, especially if you're able to do a full-blown simulation, that's only a predicted single value right off of the equation. There's error associated with this. Let's model the error as well. And in at risk, what you would be working with is, and I'm in the at-risk ribbon now, and I've already defined that error term to be this specific log normal error term. The mean out of fit space was 0. The standard deviation out of fit space was, let's see, it's D22. There it is right there. That's standard error I gave you. And I'm working with what's called the log norm 2 version of this distribution, and that I know of, unless the crystal ball or ACEAA have caught up. Only at risk gives you this approach to modeling it right now. But when you've set it up that way, automatically it's calculating that the mean is not a 1, it's a 1.0028. It's giving you the standard deviation and a whole bunch of other statistical summary information for what's going on with that multiplicative log normal error term. So that's what at risk can add for you. It's an input to a simulation. Now, 1.0028 is the mean of that log normal. In other words, on average, my error is around a 0.3% on the positive side. So, and that may not seem very profound to you. It could have been, you know, if these values, if the fit hadn't been as good, the error's mean might have been even worse. In fit space, by ignoring the error term, you're ignoring something that on average is 0. So it might seem like, okay, what's the big deal? Back in unit space for a power curve, a unit learning curve model based power curve, you're finding out that by ignoring the error term, you're not multiplying by something that will be bigger than 1. I don't know if hopefully that, I don't know how to say it any plainer, is not adding something that on average is 0 might seem like it's okay. Not multiplying by something that's going to be greater than 1 is not as okay. And in fact, if you look back at the distribution itself, we've got a range here of the minimum 0 to a maximum of positive infinity for this error term. Now, you can find out that 90% of it is below 1.13, 95% actually is below there. So how serious you feel about that upper tail depends on you know, just how wide that range is. And many of you would probably even want to truncate this error term so it doesn't go anywhere near positive infinity. But it's a multiplicative error term that has an average greater than 1. So on average, you have positive error associated with your estimate when you do this approach. The combined effect of this, and it's in this last cell, is, and I've run the simulation already, is to take this predicted value, multiply it by a randomly sampled simulated input error term to get something going on in there. And just to give you a sense of what happens during the simulation, I'm going to click on the die up here and hit F9 a few times on my laptop. Watch what happens in those two cells, F10, F11. So you are randomly sampling from that log normal, getting something around a 1.0028 on average. Sometimes it's even less than 1, but it could go all the way off to positive infinity if I haven't truncated this. The simulation will do as many of those as I want it to, and will give me a resulting display of what happens for that total cost or time. Here is one particular form of that. I've calculated off to the side that just with that one error term, we've come up with a coefficient of variation for that cost or man hours of about 7.5%. You can see the combined effect is giving us a standard deviation in man hours of about 3,760. So all the statistical summary here you want. It was only one input, so there is no tornado diagram or sensitivity analysis to this, but you get a PDF, you get a CDF, you get a lot of statistical summary, and hopefully that 7.5% CV is enough to convince you that even with what appears to be a pretty small error term, because it's a multiplier, it's important to include it. And with that in mind, unless there are some questions, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think we're there. So thank you. And if there are any questions, I'll stick around.
Oh, Steve, there is a comment from Peter Braxton. I'm going to unmute him.
Hi,
so
Peter.
Peter,
Hi, Steve. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. Yeah. Just a comment. This is great, and I like how you've modeled everything. And I'm not as familiar with the ACEAA lot midpoint approximation, but I do know that using that approximation does, introduce a small amount of discrepancy. And so, in this case, you're not dealing with thousands of units. You're dealing with, dozens. You could actually just have a spreadsheet, with your powers raised to the B power for those 210 rows for your 210 units, and group that, with the sums to get a more exact lot midpoint for a given value of B. So you explained the convergence and the iteration and the goal seek very clearly. That I find a lot of people need that. But even when you converge, you're converging to the approximate answer based on that. So that's maybe one level deeper than you wanted to go, but I find a lot of people are not aware of that. So anyway, a great presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. Exactly right. And I've done a number of these where I've taken that next step. I've also laid down, when I had access to it, I've done COSTAT at the same time and compared the results. And you're exactly right. I mean, you're going to see small differences between what COSTAT gives, what this gives, and what the straight summation gives for, unless you're doing something like missiles or something where you've got just tens of thousands of units. It's okay with smaller quantities to go ahead and do that straight summation you're talking about. But my experience is that the difference is so small, it's almost safe to ignore it. The one thing I didn't do here, and I may be showing my hand a little more than I wanted to, but I did not show what DAU used to and hopefully no longer teaches as their lot midpoint approximation. It was like pulling teeth to get them even to work with this one. They were using one that was much simpler in their learning curve classes. And I had to really fight with them to even give this version of the approximation. So really good point, Peter. And there are multiple ways of tackling it. The COSTAT one, although it's 6 term, and this one come out very, very close. But if you want to be exact, Peter is exactly right. There is a 1 raised to the B kind of, I raised to the B kind of thing that you can work with as summations to do. Maybe your training material, get into that. I know you're involved with training for ICEAA, Peter, or used to be.
Yeah, CBOC Module 7, I think, touches on that briefly. And you're right, DAU has gotten away from, at least for the most part, those rules of thumb. I think they tend to creep back in there, but I agree wholeheartedly. The approximation formula is much better than just using the rule of thumb for a lot midpoint. Over. Cool,
thank you. CBOC Module 7, I think you said, right?
Yes, sir. That's a learning curve module.
Thanks. Anything else, Chelsea?
It looks like we don't have any more questions. So if you have any closing remarks, Steve.
I don't, just that this is fun stuff. And, one of the criticisms I get sometimes, I put a lot of thought into the order of the way I'm going to present things. If this is the first time you've seen it and go, okay, I got it, you may not. The criticism I hear quite a bit is, darn, you made it look so easy, but when I tried it, it really wasn't that easy. Well, of course I'm going to make it look easy. I don't want to stand here and make it look difficult. To prove to yourself you've got it, I really suggest, while it's still fresh in your mind, grab the files, especially that Excel file that I've got, and go through and play around with the numbers a little bit, poke into the formulas and make sure you see how everything ties together. But once you get it, I think you'll get it. That you read about it, you go through that circular logic and you go, God, I don't even know what it says to do. Then you try it and it starts to make a little more sense. So please give it a try. And thank you for your attention.
All right, thanks everyone. And you can watch the recording on our YouTube channel and also our website after it'll be posted shortly. So thanks again, Steve, for another great presentation. And thanks everyone for joining, and take care.
Have a good day, everybody.